He's writing a prescription for hope. Here's Michelle.
Thank you, big voice guy. A prescription for hope. Yeah, we could use a little bit of this. Life has gotten very crazy in 1 year's time. I remember, what were you doing when you found out that the world was going to be locked down? Yeah, I knew it was coming. For me, I went out and did a bunch of things that I knew I'd love to do, meet friends for coffee, go out to dinner, mani-pedi, whatever, because I thought, you know what? This may be the last day of normalcy for a long time. What if it's for the rest of my life? Well, as we move forward, you got to really hope that those people making decisions know exactly what they're doing. Why are they making these decisions? And are we right to just kind of lockstep and not question? Well, there's one man who's done research. And that's what I want to hear. It's not just about us against them and my opinion against your opinion. And I really just want to look at the research. If research says lock down, stay home, or you're going to turn into zombies, dude, I'm locking down, staying home, and I'm getting ready for the zompocalypse. If it says something else, I want to hear about it. And if it is saying something else and I'm not hearing about it, well, then by golly, I'm going to do a show on it. Michael Beatrice is with us. He's a coronavirus researcher, and he's written the book, COVID-19 Lockdowns on Trial. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Now, Michael, right off the bat, you're going to have to correct me if I said your last name wrong, because I ditched out and didn't ask you before we talked.
No, you nailed it, which is a low percentage, so good job.
I'm so delighted to have you on the show today. I like the name of your book, too. I want you to think about this as you're listening today, because when you have something on trial, you get to hear all the sides presented, and then you make a logical conclusion based on the evidence, right? Somehow I think that all of the evidence is not being presented. So we're going to talk about that. But let's start right off, Michael, with what was the impetus to write this book?
So going back a little over a year, like a lot of Americans, COVID-19 was just starting. This was going back to February, starting to kind of get in the news, and we canceled flights to and from China, and then Europe. And personally, I was following the cruise ships. There were 2 quarantine cruise ships, one off Japan, one off of California, and they both had an outbreak of COVID-19. So I thought, it sounded like kind of a serious thing. And when the second cruise ship ported in, I've been on one cruise. I happen to have been on that one cruise ship, the Grand Princess. So I followed it with a little bit more interest. And if you remember when it ported in early March, it was kind of into Oakland. It was kind of covered like the Bronco chase on the news. And then,
yes.
When it ported in, nothing really happened. And I thought, well, that's odd. Wuhan had locked down, and we canceled flights, and there was a lot of attention. And about 10 days later, the Imperial College released a model. This is out of London. And they predicted in a worst-case scenario, we'd lose over 2 million American lives by last summer. I thought, wow, that's, sort of at a logic test, it seemed like we would have had more activity on the cruise ships. So I took the assumptions from the Imperial College model and plugged them into the demographics on the 2 cruise ships. We should have had 155 people die on the cruise ships if the models were correct. The model was correct. And we had 10. And so, and everybody that died, 7 of the 10 had underlying conditions, and they were all elderly. So it was clear the model wasn't going to play out. It was the perfect scientific experiment, right? It was a do-nothing scenario. You had a contained environment, a lot of potential for spread. And then we locked down. And I'd written a lot of books in my past, business books published by McGraw-Hill. And when we triggered in April 40 million people becoming unemployed, I just woke up one Monday morning. My son was home from college because his college had closed, his university. And I told him I was going to write a book about this. And a month later, it was done.
Wow. And there is a lot of information that is indeed out there that for some reason we're not getting a lot of that. And I did want to start a bit with that model that came out of England, that came out of Great Britain. And it's not the first time that the person behind this model has gotten things outlandishly wrong. On one hand, Michael, I understand we want to go to the worst case scenario, because if you're a politician and you underestimate, you are going to get lambasted and people could die. So you err on the side of caution. But these numbers not only haven't played out, but from the history of the same reporting, they haven't played out in the past as well.
So here's what's crazy, right? So you've got Professor Ferguson is the author of that, and he's done a lot of research, and he's clearly a bright guy. And he put together this model, and then a few days later, Dr. Sunetra Gupta, who is also one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration, but back in March, she's at Oxford, also in London, she called out the assumptions in the model had a lot of flaws. And so she released basically a peer review of it. The very next, this is so crazy, the very next day, Ferguson changed his modeling, and he went from 500,000 people in the UK dying to 20,000, and then qualifying that with saying most of them would have died this year anyway. So
wait a minute.
Hold on. So we go from there. We go to the IHME models. That's actually from your neck of the woods. And the IHME had produced models that had initially predicted 160 to 200,000 people dying. And then they had reeled that back by May to 40 to 60,000. I can tell you that even me, with simply using the calculator on my phone and a notepad, by looking at some of the data from the cruise ships and the aircraft carriers, my number was 238,000 people that would probably die. And if you look at the actual deaths, the excess deaths from COVID-19 over the last year, that's about where we are. And to put this a little even more in context, Alex Berenson, who's really become the face of sort of team reality data on the pandemic, even he predicted in May 450 to 600,000 people would die of COVID. So none of the people like me that have analyzed this or believe or think that COVID-19 is nothing. It's very real. I lost a family member in a care facility to it. So COVID-19 is real. The question is how real, how significant relative to these lockdown restrictions for what's going to end up a year and a half at least. How much of that is warranted? That's the question.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that it is a question. I think there are some others as well. That what are the unforeseen costs in lives and livelihood, and can you weigh those out? And when we think of these choices that we've made, it's like a big experiment. Never before in the history of man have you locked away the healthy. You've always locked away the sick. And that's fine. I'm fine with, let's try something new. Let's see if this works. Fine, we have. Let's see how it has played out. What does the research show us, Michael?
So first off, I think it's important, and I'm writing a second book, and I just completed a lot of this research over the last month. So I think it's valuable to take a look back real quick at what did the WHO and the CDC say about a pandemic before COVID. Both of them, in the most extreme measure, had predicted or had recommended in their playbook something like schools closed for 4 weeks, the people that are sick either self-quarantine or wear masks in public, and you might stagger shifts for workplaces to enable some social distancing. And that's it, okay? That's it. That's the most, and this is a level 2 or class 2 pandemic. COVID-19 is a class 2 pandemic based on a class 1 to 5, according to these playbooks. Somehow we just went off the rails. And so we've pursued sort of this zero COVID approach where we have to get down to zero COVID.
Yeah, what happened do you remember at the beginning? I'm sorry to cut you off, Michael, but do you remember at the beginning it was about flattening the curve. I mean, it's only been a
Right.
year, people. Let's try to remember what happened back then. It was, okay, we have to lock down because we don't want to overwhelm our hospital system right now. We
Right.
still don't know what
And
this is, yada, yada, right?
And here's what the curve was. The curve was, according to the Imperial College, that in a worst case scenario, we would have a 9-fold shortfall in ICUs on our peak day, which was going to be sometime in June. In a best case scenario, with all these mitigations, we would have a 3-fold shortfall. And so that's what the curve was. The curve wasn't to eradicate COVID. The curve was to slow it down, to streamline it, so we would have capacity to meet the healthcare needs. Major flaws in the models, right? One major flaw, and I read this, like Michael Osterholm has been a big voice in this. He predicted back in March that we would have 18% of our elderly would lose their life to COVID-19. Even that's a wildly exaggerated estimate, and based on the data that we had from Italy and the cruise ships, it was impossible. And so somehow we did go off the rails from streamlining hospital capacity. I mean, right now, Michelle, we're at about 3% nationally of COVID patients occupying beds in hospitals.
Yeah.
And we still have kids out of school. And to take this one step further, did you know that in 2020, 15 times more deaths have happened to people under 18 in transportation-related accidents than COVID? And over 10 times more kids have lost their lives to suicide last year than to COVID.
Oh, it does put it in perspective. It goes back to what are the unforeseen results of this little experiment. Look, there's been some things that we have to just check off here. One, COVID is serious. You've lost a family member. One of my best friends just lost her grandmother yesterday. There are lasting effects for those who do survive. For some that do survive, there can be some lasting effects. It's a nasty thing. We know this. We also know that there's been some good things that have come out. Companies have learned that people can work remotely, and that lightens the load on our environment. It lightens the load, on our streets. It takes a bit of a load off for family members who can spend more time with their families instead of in transit. And I'm talking from Seattle. I think we have like the 4th worst traffic in the nation. There's been some good things that have come out of this pandemic where we've had to make decisions. But you use the phrase off the rails. And we really have. We've criminalized people for not wearing masks, which research shows not really all that effective. All it is a little security blanket on your face to make you feel better.
So look, I wish masks worked. I do. And I live in Dallas, Texas.
Can I stop you for just one
we-
second? I want to preface this for
Yeah.
those who do not know me very well. I'm a little bit of a germaphobe. I was the chick who would always use a scarf or pull my sleeve over my hand to open a public door. I mean, I'm not saying, and if I loved going to Japan because everyone wear more masks, and I was like, oh, that's great. I don't want to catch things from people. I bring sanitizer, a natural sanitizer with lavender with me everywhere. If I'm on a plane, I spray the heck out of that thing. So I'm sorry to interrupt you, Michael. I had to preface that and not say, let's just all, whatever, germs, who cares? I believe in a strong immune system. I'm a little bit of a germaphobe, but as you said, you're in Texas where masks are coming off. I was just there a week and a half ago. That was kind of glorious, but things are not, they're not playing out with the whole mask thing like we thought.
Right. First off, for anybody who thinks that Texas is now a free-for-all, it's not. I can tell you people are wearing masks like crazy, and they don't have to. Even in the gym, I belong to an LA Fitness, and over 50% of the people that work out there, while they're working out, still wear masks.
And in the
stores.
So
it's not a free-for-all.
In the stores.
Most of the retailers require them.
Yeah.
So I personally have not worn a mask in all the major grocery stores, but I've always had one in my pocket. I'm more curious to see kind of what the reaction might be. But I don't want to cause anything, so I always have a mask and I put it on.
Did you have anyone
But here's the
bothered by that? Because I didn't when I was in Houston. I had, no, there was 50% of the people were not wearing masks, and no one bothered anyone who did. I think there was a mindset that if my mask is so good, then it doesn't matter if you have one.
Yeah, sadly, people do believe that. Look, so what the data shows on anything less than an N95, and Senator Rand Paul has done a pretty decent job of sort of encapsulating this in some sound bites, and as he sparred with Dr. Fauci over the last few months, including a big one last week. But there's two things that are wrong with face masks and why they haven't proven to be effective. One, they've got gaps on the sides for a lot of air to breathe in and out through that. And the other thing is the pore size in anything less than an N95, the pore size is 200 to 800 times larger than a viral particle, an aerosol particle. That's why you can't find any correlating data in the world where you've got high mask adoption, like let's say over 90%, and continued suppression of the virus. When it comes in like a little hurricane. You've got a 4 to 6 week period, just like you did in Seattle in the wintertime. You've got a 4 to 6 week period where hospitalizations rise, and then it just recedes. It's crazy to watch this. It's actually been fascinating to watch because these curves are almost the same all over the world whenever these little waves hit. But you can't find a data point in the world where masks have continued that suppression.
Interesting. With masks, man, you can smell the body odor of the guy next to you in line, and so you're thinking the aerosols of the virus so much smaller than the guy's BO. Yeah, it can get through a mask, and some of the problems that people have while wearing masks just doesn't matter. Oh my goodness, true story, Michael. We were just sharing this last week with a guy who's a regular on our show, Coach E. He's in the grocery store. Two people with masks are trying to talk to the guy behind the counter. They're deaf and they cannot hear him. They cannot read his lips. They try to give him a note and he's just getting perturbed. He's ready to call security and get them out of there. Luckily, Coach E speaks in American Sign Language and was able to mitigate. But man, people are getting furious. People are really uptight. And the isolation, on another hand, has caused us to tribe up, to be easily offended, and to look at people as they are the enemy. Has that not played out in statistics?
Well, a couple things. One, I've never seen so much passion stirred up on a topic, and to me this isn't political. You can read my whole book and not know who I voted for.
Exactly.
So it's not like, even though there's very, very high correlations between Democrat-led states and cities and tight restriction, Republicans to fact. But that doesn't mean that all Republicans have been relaxed, and that doesn't mean that all Democrats have been led super strict. But it's highly 85% or so correlated, and I mapped that out, in lockdowns on trial too. But yeah, I mean, when I've gone out on Twitter, I wasn't on Twitter before this, but when I would provide statistics and data to defend Kristi Noem in South Dakota, nothing stirred up more passion in any of the data responses or data that I would provide, like defending Kristi Noem. The question is, when you look at the states that have looser restrictions like Oklahoma, Georgia, Florida, the Dakotas, and there's more, but let's just take those 5. If lockdowns work, those states should be doing much, much worse in COVID activity than states that have tight restrictions. It should be fairly obvious. Now, I don't mean like 50%. It should be like 2, 3, 5, 10 times. They should have much more COVID activity if they have loose restrictions and people are kind of going about their business. In most cases, there's no correlating data that shows. If you were to look at data, the data curves, and I didn't put states on them, but I layered one on top of the other, you would not be able to identify which states had tight restrictions and which ones didn't. It is indistinguishable. Amazing. And so, again, the burden of proof isn't on the loose states. The burden of proof is on the ones that have all these mitigations, all these tight lockdowns, to prove they can do better. They just can't.
Well, we're not hearing that reported readily in any consistency in the media. We're not hearing that. We should know that so that we can make better decisions. I am really curious. You do touch on, and again, this book, COVID-19 Lockdowns on Trial, you can see all of that information on MyMichelleLive and get your own copy of the book. I think it's well worth it. You do talk about the differing states and the differing ideas and some of the similar results. But I'm really curious, why do you think we're seeing 85% of Democrats be and similarly Republicans having this more freedom of masks and ease of restrictions for Republicans, and much more strict, draconian for Democrats? Why is that?
Well, first off, if I could answer that question, so I can give you a couple opinions, but
there you go.
I'm in a think tank on this, and a lot of us wonder that too. One is Dr. Scott Atlas, who was on President Trump's COVID team, and he's a teacher and a professor at Stanford. So Scott Atlas he's been in the inner circle. He flat out said repeatedly, "I've been there. I can tell you people are just simply doubling down because they don't want to admit they were wrong. So let's just table that." The other is, in general, if there's one sort of big one-sentence description of Republicans versus Democrats, Democrats generally feel like the government can do things better than people's independent decisions. And Republicans tend to, and Rand Paul's a good example of this, tend to think people can make good decisions on their own, and the government shouldn't control those decisions. And that's sort of a big difference, too. So I think there's a combination of those two things. But I'm open. It's crazy because the people that are most harmed by the lockdowns are also traditional Democrat constituents, right? I mean, the people that are high income earners, they're really not affected by this. They might get to stay home, right, and work remote, like you called on earlier, and that could be a life experience positive. If they've got fractured education, they've got the resources to get tutors, or they might have a stay-at-home parent, and so they can sort of bridge that gap. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. The people that have been most screwed by this are parents of kids that don't have the means and the resources. And so you're going to see a widening gap between, sort of household income and what's happened with those kids, with the lower income kids having less resources. That education gap's going to widen. It's going to have massive long-term effects.
When we look at the the effects on people, it is heinous, and we kind of ignore that because we're trying to save lives. But if we could actually work together, some of the things that you said, Michael, would be a perfect mesh between Democrat and Republican kind of ideology. If your thoughts on this bear out to be true, think about it. For the most part, you're seeing in Texas, and I saw in Texas when I was there a week and a half ago, that many people are, even though you have loose restrictions, almost every single establishment sanitizing, wearing masks, or their employees wearing masks, and doing some things that they think will be responsible to try to keep people from catching the virus, because they're a business. They don't want the bad press. Someone got COVID from, Wiki Mark over here. And then on the other hand, the Democrat response, Michael, is, well, government needs to step in because, people aren't smart enough to make their own decisions, basically. Well, sometimes people are stupid. I'm sorry. It's true. We have memes all over the internet for that. So somewhere in there, having freedom, but also being able to say, hey, if you're stepping out of line, we have resources for this, or we have resources to encourage businesses to have people stay home instead of come to work sick. There are ways that we should be working together. Your thoughts?
I think there's no question about that. But I think that the even the idea of what people's personal responsibility and what they would do, it's still sort of, you have to go back to the source and say, do these mitigations work, and how much can you do? And I will tell you, right? I mean, we know who's at risk. If you're under 65 and severely obese, you are at risk. That is at risk. If you're over 65, you're at risk, period. And if you have specific underlying conditions like hypertension, a respiratory condition, you are also at accelerated risk. Everybody else really isn't. And so if we only encourage the people in these at-risk groups to sort of keep a low profile. So an example is I've got 89-year-old parents in Detroit, which was hard hit in April last year. My brother and I have kept them under a very close wrap, right? We don't want them going out, right? They would be vulnerable. I've got a 21-year-old son at a Big 12 school. I've told him to live his life as freely as he can, as I do. And so that's all you can do. The question isn't, oh, listen, COVID-19 is nothing. We should just blow it off and live. It should be a free-for-all. That's not true. Mm-hmm. But you can't lock down and do a one-size-fits-all mitigation spread for huge segments of the population that aren't at risk, which, again, includes 50 million kids that will have lost a year and a half of education. And I saw this great article. You can find it if you do a search. It's called something like A Progressive's Rant on Education, but it was by a mom, self-admitted progressive in San Francisco or Oakland. And her comment was going off about the data in schools. But one line that I'll never forget is she said, when did the Republicans become the party of education and children? She goes, that's what I'd like to know.
Ouch.
And that's where we've landed.
Yeah. That's kind of food for thought right there. And then we get into, I don't want to sound conspiratorial, so forgive me and put me in line, Michael, if I'm getting there. But then a lot of this, you wonder when we are force-fed a vaccination, where people are making, Bill Gates, the savior of the world, the second coming, is making billions from this. Fauci has ties to this. And you look at that and you follow the money and you go, oh, is this all about making people money and, sticking the needle in everyone before we even know how these vaccines will play out, before we really know some of these so very new, we're not, it's underreported in the media how many people are having serious complications and dying after taking the vaccine, and the extreme amount of numbers of people who are just getting COVID because they've gotten the vaccine. We're not hearing that, so that we can't weigh things out to find out what's best.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think a couple things on this. One, the only way out of a pandemic in history, any pandemic, is herd immunity, right? It's when enough people in the population get immune, can't transmit it anymore, and eventually it just fizzles out. And so you can reach herd immunity one of two ways. You can do it naturally by enough people getting infected and getting through it, or you can have a vaccination. That's it. Those are the end games, regardless of how we get there. So when you look at the vaccines, we've got about 1 in 10,000 that seems to have a serious complication side effect. That's much higher than any other vaccine that we that any of us would take. Mm-hmm. Having said that, if you're in an elderly population group, or you've got one of the underlying conditions like severe obesity I mentioned, your odds are better of risking the side effect of the vaccine and riding it out.
Yeah.
You are.
That's what good medicine is about, Michael. It is, we are great in our Western medicine of intervening in life and death situations, and that's where something like that is important. But you mentioned this earlier. We have this idea that we've got to get to zero. You remember the bubonic plague? There are still at least 3 or 4 people in the United States of America every single year that comes down with the bubonic plague. Once something is out there, it may not ever really go away, but it becomes no longer a threat to the mass public when we've reached herd immunity, which is 30%, correct?
It varies, but I would say here's what herd immunity in general would have to be higher than that. You'd have to be well over half to really squash this thing. But you've got a chunk of One thing I tell you, though, is they always talk about people need to be vaccines and the vaccine passports, and you need to show proof of a vaccine. What they ignore all over the world is people that have been infected, right? If you've been infected and you recover, and by the way, every single one of I don't know, I don't think I've gotten it, but every single one of my close friends has gotten it. My son and all his roommates at college got it 4 weeks ago. When you get it and get through it, you are likely to have much better immunity than from one of the RNA vaccines. Mm-hmm. That is a historical medical fact. Now, we'll see how it all plays out. But we sort of ignore that. So they're like, well, we need to get 100 million people vaccinated, well, at least affected by the virus. So between that and we're surgically targeting the vulnerable groups that we've already discussed with vaccines, but we're pretty much through it. I mean, the pandemic as we knew it has been over really since February. We're just kind of running the clock out, right? We will never really have what we encountered last summer, last spring, and to a degree even in the wintertime. That just isn't going to happen again here. And the variants aren't proving to be, for all the discussion about, oh my God, the variants are going to get us. Well, the UK variant is the one they talk about the most, and while they talk about the UK variant being dangerous here, the UK is cratering with COVID activity. It's got the exact same curve. You could lay one on top of the other as America in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. So the UK variant might be really dangerous, but it really hasn't been in the UK.
Wow, that's fascinating. That is a bit of information I did not know. And part of the reason it's hard to find some of these, sometimes you really have to dig with the vaccine. There's even concern that once you have gotten vaccinated and you can develop even a mild case of COVID, maybe much more mild, tends to be the way things go with vaccines, that you're still maybe transmittable. And so we have this false idea, hey, I've got this vaccine. I can, do whatever I want, go wherever I want, go visit grandma in the nursing home. And it just may not be that way. And I think that responsibility of misinformation falls squarely on our politicians and on the media.
No doubt. I mean, it's the media has created this sort of zero COVID scorecard. And so a great example of that is last August, there was an article in Politico that sort of rated the best states with their COVID responses. And so I was really excited. I was working on a second edition of my book. It came out in November, but I was working on that. And I thought, oh, this is going to be great. Which direction do they go? Sort of the South Dakota, Florida, Georgia, Texas route, or the California, Illinois, New York route? Sure enough, they rated California very high, New York very high. Meanwhile, these other states with looser restrictions had done no worse. But the media has created sort of this zero COVID where if you're not doing everything you can do, collateral consequences be damned, right? It doesn't matter if kids are out of school. There's hardly any reporting on that in the media, hardly any. There's really no reporting on deaths of despair or all the things that haven't happened as a result of the lockdowns. Things like 46% of the most common cancers didn't get diagnosed in 2020. Huge.
Oh, gosh, yes.
650,000 cancer patients didn't get treatments during the lockdowns. Half child immunizations didn't get done. A couple 100,000 cases of child abuse happened. A quarter of college-age kids thought about suicide. You don't hear about any of that kind of stuff. It's all about zero COVID. And so because of that, these governors have sort of a green light without really much rebellion. I've been to Seattle a bunch of times. My guess is people really do want masks and they want to stay locked down. When I say most, I mean probably over half the population in Washington State or for sure in Seattle.
Right. I cannot walk to my mailbox and not wear a mask without somebody freaking out and running to the other side of the street as though, I have the worst disease ever. I'm absolutely transmittable. Save yourself. So yeah, you're right. You're right.
And you can't blame those people, Michelle, because of the media. What's sort of been pummeled at them for a year straight. I mean, my son and I went mountain climbing in Jackson Hole last July. A third of the people we saw driving around in a national park, the drivers were wearing masks.
In
We
their
were
car.
climbing up at in the car, and we were
So they
climbing at
don't
about
catch it from
10.
themselves.
Crazy. And we saw climbers. We were up at about 10 or 11,000 feet on a trail that might be 5, 6 feet wide, let's say. And when some climbers would approach us, they would pull up a gator or something. And like it's just insane. But like I don't have any contempt for anybody, right? I mean, information is power, right? And it breeds a little bit of confidence and peace of mind. And most people just don't have the information.
Yeah, and so you say I don't blame them, but in a way I do, because we just lockstep and we get lazy. This is a government of, by, and for we the people. And while this isn't a political issue, as you have mentioned, and as you can see in your book, there's no politics in your book. But nonetheless, we are. This is supposed to be of, by, and for we the people. And this government works with an informed people, not a people just given to its propaganda and that sounds good and I believe it. Look a little bit deeper. We have that responsibility to do that. That's my chastisement for the day. Are you still with me? I think I just dropped a little bit as we talk with Michael Beatrice. He is the author of COVID-19 Lockdown on Trial. Michael, you still with us? I hope we didn't lose you for good because I have another question. But, you know, a lot of the questions that you may have, you can find in. Yes, we did lose him. Let me see if I can get him back. A lot of the questions that you may have that I didn't ask, you can find in Michael's book. I'm giving him a call back and to see if maybe we can get him
Hello.
back to. Hi, sorry about that. Call
me back.
dropped out. We're winding up anyway, but Michael, I did want to ask you in your research, was there any like wow surprises, just information that blew you away?
Well, the biggest wow, which is what triggered me to write the book, but the biggest wow is that kids are not affected by this at all, and we've got them out of school, right? I mean, you know, you can sort of unemployment. When you talk about unemployment, there's a little bit of, oh, well, you think money is more important than saving lives. Okay. You can't claim higher ground on education, right? Kids are not affected. They are actually at less risk for COVID than the flu. That's just a fact. The average age of teachers is 41. 90% of teachers are not in at-risk categories. Teaching face-to-face with normal protocols, as we've seen in studies from Norway and Denmark, and sort of if anybody felt like doing the research, I've talked to 2 private schools that have normal protocols, no masks, one in Texas, one in Georgia, and they haven't had incidents too. The research is there. The data's there.
Okay.
If anybody wants to, if the CDC would find it. Keeping kids out of school is a human rights crime. It's the most catastrophic fallout from this thing, and that's the biggest wow I experienced.
Okay, maybe let me ask this then. Keeping kids out of school, kids are not affected really. It's kind of a non-issue if they get COVID. What about the transmission, though? Bringing it home to my house where,
Right.
you know, I have an elderly parent that I'm taking care of. That, you know, that may be a real issue.
So 2 things. One, kids are proven to not be efficient transmitters of this. We don't know why, but that is a data fact. The other data fact is 4% of kids K through 12 live with their grandparents. If a household had a child that was attending school and they had an elderly parent who could be at risk, yeah, maybe they do something different. That doesn't mean that for the 96% that aren't in that bucket, we create this policy to keep them out of school for a year and a half. I mean, maybe that child, maybe we do something different for them and do a different accommodation. I mean, you'd be flexible on something like that. But you don't create a policy that spreads across 100% of students when 96% don't have the situation you just described.
So, Michael, final question. In all of this, we can see the data play out. I do not fault politicians who, at the beginning of this outbreak, took extreme draconian measures because we didn't know what the virus was. We didn't know its effects. We didn't know who could catch it. We didn't know. There was so much we didn't know. But with everyone in lockdown and nothing else to do, we got some data fairly quickly. Now, here we are a year later, and we have extraordinary books that have checked out the data like yours, COVID-19 lockdowns on trial. We know now, but something you said earlier, maybe we just don't like to admit that we're wrong on individual levels. If people are confronted with the evidence, well, I still believe, we don't want to admit that we're wrong. So where do we go from here? And is there any hope?
Well, I think, first off, I have a lot of forgiveness personally for decisions that were made in March and April last year.
Absolutely.
I do. People didn't apply critical thinking, like looking at the cruise ships and really peeling it apart. But let's just say you want to err on the side of caution. Mm-hmm. So I didn't get on Governor Newsom in my book for being the first state to lock down, and I didn't get on Governor Cuomo for the nursing home policy. I did get on everybody when schools didn't reopen in the fall. And one other point on this is, when you hold people sort of accountable for this, it wouldn't have been intuitive to Governors Whitmer or Cuomo about the nursing home policy. You know who should have known, though? Based on the data from the cruise ships and Italy, Drs. Fauci, Birx, Redfield from the CDC, it should have been intuitive to them out of the gate. This thing is merciless on the elderly with underlying conditions. You can't create an environment where, you're sort of creating infection, the potential for infection, right? And so it should have been intuitive to them. They didn't see it. They shouldn't even be in those roles after making a mistake like that.
Yeah, it gives you food for thought, and you have to be smart enough to question that if somebody is in a position as they're in, unquestioned, like a guru of all knowledge without being able to be questioned, that is dangerous, and it's part of some of the dangerous areas that we're getting into in our nation today, which may be fodder for another program. But this is my first encounter with Michael Betros. He is I'm probably saying your name wrong. See, this is what I do when I don't research it beforehand. Nonetheless, he's a coronavirus researcher, author, and his latest book, COVID-19 Lockdowns on Trial. I have links on MyMichelleLive. We will have them on as we put on the audio version of this podcast, and you can pick up the book and get educated yourself. I think we all have that responsibility. That's where we can make the best choices going forward, because we're an informed public. We can demand that of those who are our representatives, who work for us. We can demand that of the media and say, hey, this crazy kind of reporting, no more. We want to hear real reporting. We want to hear the whole story. This falls on us. I'm not going to blame anyone else anymore. It's my responsibility, and I'm taking it. Michael, it has been such a joy to meet you, and I hope you'll consider coming back on and checking in as you continue your research and keep us educated.
I would love that, and you reach out too, and then stay on when we're done if you have a few minutes.
You got it. Hey, thanks for listening. This is Health Watch.
More Health Watch at MyMichelleLive.com.